Hello and welcome to another episode of Full Court Finance here at Zach's. I'm your host, Ben Rains. This Monday morning after the first weekend of March Madness, the big college basketball tournament that everyone loves. And this week they might love to hate it because everyone got knocked off that was a higher seed, it seemed like, this weekend. But this weekend was the NCAA tournament, so that's what we're talking about. Talking about how much money this tournament makes, who the TV partners are, some of the biggest sponsors, the sportswear companies involved, the betting aspect involved, some new scandals that are popping up. But before we do that, I kind of just want to talk a little bit about the games this weekend in case no one watched. It seems like every first round or first couple rounds of the tournament, so that first 4 days, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, people always say, oh, this was crazy. This is the craziest weekend we've ever had in college basketball. And it does seem like every year something crazy happens. But this year specifically was one of the crazier weekends in college basketball in the NCAA tournament, where you had two number one seeds getting knocked off. You had Virginia losing as the first ever number one seed to lose to a 16 seed in the first round. I didn't watch the game, so I was scrolling through my phone late Friday night, and I saw Virginia loses to UMBC. I forget, it's University of Maryland, Baltimore, or some county or something like that. And I thought that can't be right because it said they lost by 20. But yeah, sure enough, one of the number one seeds in the tournament, who CBS, the most people picked Virginia to be their champion, and they lost by 20 on Friday night. So that busted a lot of people's brackets right away. And then, so as of Thursday, so the first day of the tournament, ESPN had 17.3 million brackets filled out. There was only 6,000 perfect brackets after the first day of the tournament. But then by Friday night, CBS Sports, their brackets had 0 perfect brackets left. So by the end of the first round of the tournament, because Virginia lost, which never happens, and then ESPN, out of those 17 million brackets, they had nobody get the Sweet 16 all correct. And they had only 3 people even got 15 out of the 16 teams right, which is pretty crazy. So that's what you have going on there. It was a lot of big beats. You had Virginia losing. You had Michigan State, who was a hot pick to win the championship. Then you had UNC losing, so North Carolina lost. Arizona lost. Xavier lost. But you still have some big names. Villanova, Duke, Kansas are still in there. But yeah, it was definitely a huge weekend of upsets. I had Arizona in my championship game, not winning, so that's good. So I had Duke versus Arizona, but at least Duke is still alive, and we'll see. But yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the craziness of the weekend because, like I was saying before, we always talk about how you never know what's going to happen, but this weekend really was a lot of. You never see 2 number one seeds lose the first weekend. It never happens. And it's literally never happened that a number one seed lost in the first round. So Virginia's going to have a long off season, and that the team that beat them, UMBC, good for them, even though they ended up losing their next game. But it was fun while it lasted. The fans probably went nuts. There's no way they ever thought they were going to win that game. I don't know how any of the players on the team could have even thought they were going to win that game. But then when they crushed Virginia by 20, it must have been really fun. And it seemed like that this first round, the craziness helped because the ratings that were out by the time I was recording this morning, Monday morning, they didn't have the second round ratings yet. But for CBS primetime for the first round, so Thursday and Friday, the games averaged around 4.98 million, so around 5 million viewers, according to Nielsen, and that's up 11% from last year. So that's good, and at a time when just less people are watching television, like we've talked about numerous times on the show before. And then if you count all of the linear and digital platforms across all of the networks that are covering the tournament, which is TBS, CBS, TNT, True TV, and the NCAA March Madness live streaming website, they average 8.6 million viewers, and that's up from last year as well. So that's good news for the television partners and the NCAA, is that more people are watching this year, and maybe it was because there was just such craziness. And that brings me right to my first big topic, which is how much money is being spent on this tournament is kind of mind-boggling when you think that it's only 3 weeks long. I believe it's 63 games total. And so 2 years ago, you had CBS and Time Warner's Turner. They extended their current March Madness deal, which was going to run through the end of the 2024 college basketball season. So they had a 14-year deal worth $10.8 billion. And then before that was up, way before that was up, then they extended it through the end of the 2032 season for $8.8 billion. So 8 years, $8.8 billion. So about $1 billion a year for a 3-week college basketball tournament. Seems kind of crazy, but then you realize this is the perfect lull in sports where this is really all that's going on. NBA playoffs haven't happened yet. Football is still a long way away. Major League Baseball still hasn't started. They're playing spring training, and then golf started, but the Masters is still a couple weeks away. So this is the perfect time for CBS and Turner to have this lull of early spring. People are still sitting in their houses watching sports on TV. So this is great for them, and it's really just a bet on. It's a calculated risk on that live sports are going to be all that matters for advertisers, because at this point, as most of you know, most advertisers are leaving for Facebook or Google, or they're getting out of television. So one of the last big things that anyone cares about on TV in terms of live audiences where people are going to sit through ads is live sports. But then as well, when CBS signed this new deal, they have the rights to, so CBS and Turner have the rights to whatever platforms people are watching this through the end of their 2032 deal. So they basically bought it. No matter how people are consuming it, CBS is going to get to broadcast it in Turner. So the exact quote from this Wall Street Journal article in 2016 was, whatever new platforms develop, we have all those rights. This is the CBS sports chairman. And then he said, if people are watching on skinny bundles, on a phone, on Apple TV, we have the ability to exploit all of those rights going forward. So they were planning for what even a couple years ago seemed pretty obvious, that people aren't going to be watching television as they have been in the past. And then that brings me to my next subject, which is the more money that's pouring into this. So you have CBS and Turner they drive the most revenue for this 3-week college basketball tournament. But then you also have the marketing partners. So you have Capital One has been one of the biggest sponsors. You will see their commercials nonstop for the 3 weeks straight with Charles Barkley, Spike Lee, and Samuel L. Jackson. Those will be funny for a while, but then probably by the Final Four, everyone who's watching will be sick of seeing them over and over again. But that's a lot of viewers. That's why Capital One's there. And then you have AT&T and Coca-Cola are the other two presented by official sponsors of the whole tournament. So that's Capital One, AT&T, and Coke. And then you have other smaller sponsors. You have Buick, Lowe's, Pizza Hut. So that's Yum Brands, Pizza Hut. And they're running, which at first, I think it came out a couple years ago, and I thought it was a joke. They're running these ads where you have shoes that you press this button on, basketball shoes, and they order your pizza for you. And I was like, this has to just be it's a gimmick kind of funny joke, order Pizza Hut while you watch college basketball. But then I looked it up, and supposedly you can really buy these shoes that Pizza Hut sells, that for the 3 weeks during the college basketball tournament, you can hit a button on your shoe and it orders Pizza Hut. That makes no sense, but I think it's hilarious. If anyone is listening to this and knows anyone that's doing that, please email us after the show. That would be hilarious to just know why you're doing it or why anyone's deciding to do that. But yeah, on a little side note, I just thought that was one of the funnier sponsorship marketing ploys during the NCAA tournament. And then this brings us to, there's all this money being spent, all this money being generated for this 3 weeks of, it's college basketball, and it brings me to how much money the NCAA is making. So for fiscal 2017, it was the first time the NCAA officially reported revenues of more than $1 billion. So they made $1.06 billion in their most recently reported year. And that comes mostly from the broadcast rights for the NCAA tournament So that was last year. I think that would have been like around $750 million or something like that for last year's broadcast rights. And then they made $129 million from ticket sales from the NCAA tournament, which also includes the NIT, which is that secondary college basketball tournament that most people don't watch unless your team's in it or you're huge into sports gambling. So that, yeah, $130 million from 3 weeks of college basketball tournaments on ticket sales alone. And then about $60 million from the marketing rights. So that's from big companies like Capital One and AT&T, and then all of the other smaller companies. And the NCAA gets a lot of heat for, they make $1 billion, but these players who are driving all this revenue aren't getting paid. But then you do have to realize that they are, and this is what their numbers are saying, they then redistribute about 90% of their revenue back to not only the schools that are in the tournament, but all of the other Division I in NCAA schools in general for scholarship funds, stipends, medical insurance, travel, like just a slew of other things. The NCAA recently passed, there's new like cost of attendance that student athletes now get. So the complaint before was, these kids get tuition, but then they're not allowed to have a job. Well, they're not able to have a job because their time commitment is so huge. Then a lot of these kids just had no other money, so they were literally broke at college, and there are other expenses besides paying for classes and dorms. So that's something new. But what's crazy is just how much money is generated by this little tournament. And then, so for a specific example about the reimbursement from the NCAA, so the team that knocked off Virginia, UMBC, this year they'll then get a specific amount of money given to them. It's units. This is what the NCAA calls their revenue it distributes for basketball-based performance in the tournament alone. So this year, those units are worth $273,000 for a team, and then it kind of depends on how far you go in the tournament. But then it's slowly paid out over about a 6-year span, and this was a CNBC article I was reading this morning. So that over this next 6 years, this one win versus the University of Virginia in the college basketball tournament is going to be worth $1.7 million to UMBC basketball. So good for them. And that's just a little side note of how much money the NCAA is just giving out, because they are making a boatload of it. And then when you think that, I was reading this weekend that the American Gaming Association, that's sports gambling in America, that is the big national governing body, and they expect that $10 billion with a B is going to be bet just on March Madness. And only about 3% of that will be legal betting. So 3% of that's happening in Vegas, and then the other 97% of that $10 billion is just being bet around America, either on office pools, your pools with your friends, or just anywhere. So that, I mean, $10 billion in 3 weeks of just betting on college kids playing basketball is really crazy when you think about it. And so that's also where people get upset with this amateurism, and these kids aren't getting paid when you have $10 billion being bet on them winning or losing. I just thought that was crazy. And then also, and this is something I think I've mentioned on another episode of this before, last year after the NCAA tournament was over, this economist at Indiana University, Purdue University, so IUPUI, he did a little study of what college basketball teams would be worth on the open market. And so the University of Kentucky basketball alone, he estimated would be worth $340 million. So if you bought it like it was an NBA team or a Major League Baseball team, just this men's basketball at Kentucky would be worth $340 million. And then you had Louisville and Indiana and Duke were in the top 5. So that's how much money college basketball is generating. And then you look at where some of this money from these schools is specifically coming, and a lot of it's coming from sportswear companies. So you had UCLA a couple years ago signing a 15-year, $280 million deal with Under Armour, the biggest in NCAA history. And then you have all these big the big time programs. Ohio State and Texas both have 15-year, $250 million deals with Nike. University of Michigan has a similar deal, but they're actually sponsored by Jordan brand specifically from Nike. You have Notre Dame, big deal with Under Armour. Even Nebraska, University of Nebraska, used to be a big football powerhouse, relatively okay at basketball. They have a $128 million deal with Adidas. And that brings me to the sportswear companies at the NCAA tournament this year. So this year you have Nike at the start of the season. So the Power 5 schools plus Notre Dame, you had Nike sponsoring 44 of the 65, and then Adidas and Under Armour each had 10, and then Georgia Tech was the only Power 5 team not sponsored by one of those three big sportswear companies, and they're sponsored by Russell Athletic. But for all the people that now make fun of Georgia Tech, this was their last year of that deal. They are now going to be signed with Adidas. So for all of the Georgia Tech fans who are sick of looking at their Russell Athletic uniforms and thinking maybe this is why we can't get any good recruits, last year under Russell Athletic, they'll now be with Adidas. So of the 4 number 1 seeds in the tournament, you had University of Virginia, sponsored by Nike. They lost in the opening round. Villanova, sponsored by Nike. They're number 1 seed. Xavier, sponsored by Nike. They lost in the first weekend. And then you have Kansas as the last number 1 seed, and they're sponsored by Adidas. And then rounding, I'm not going to list, obviously, all the teams. But then for the number 2 seeds, so you have North Carolina, the defending national champs. They're sponsored by Nike, Jordan brand specifically, because that's where Michael Jordan went to school. Duke, also sponsored by Nike. Cincinnati, one of the only top 2 sets of number 1 or 2 seeds that was sponsored by Under Armour. And then Purdue is also sponsored by Nike. So this is a big deal for these companies. If you go on Nike's website right now, just Nike.com to buy anything, it is just hitting you in the face with NCAA tournament stuff. It is just scrolling through all of the big teams they are sponsoring in the tournament. It just says, rep your team, everything you'll need for an epic title run. And it just runs through Duke, Michigan, Ohio State, UNC, Arizona, Michigan State, Kentucky, Gonzaga, Michigan, Villanova, Virginia. Just buy as much stuff that has your team on it as possible. But then what was funny is that if you went on Adidas website or Under Armour's website, there's no mention of March Madness whatsoever, which I thought was a weird contrast that Nike, who has the most teams in the tournament, is going all in for at least the month of March for the college basketball tournament of buy your team's favorite gear for March Madness, and Adidas and Under Armour literally didn't mention it at all, even under their even under their basketball section of their websites. But what Under Armour did do is have, and I'm sure they had him do it, the Golden State Warriors star Steph Curry, who is the biggest Under Armour athlete, he sent that team UMBC after they beat Virginia. He sent him all pairs of his new Steph Curry 5s that they're debuting. He debuted them a week ago or so. Maybe it was last week. So he's been wearing the Curry 4s this whole year that were better than the Curry 3s that everyone trashed as old man, white, terrible looking, boring basketball shoes. And then these new 5s have been getting some relatively positive feedback. Maybe I'm just reading the wrong things, because in my personal opinion, I think they look terrible. I don't know if any of you have seen them. They're black. I don't know if anyone listening has heard of Lonzo Ball and the Ball family and LeVar Ball and their Big Baller brand experiment of Facebook, like television shows, and it's the Kardashians of the NBA and college basketball. And well, now none of them even play in college basketball, but they have their own brand of shoes called the Big Baller brand that they're selling shoes on the internet for like $500. And for this summer, people that spent the $500 then weren't even getting them at some point. But it's not good when a guy started his own little company to make shoes, and then a big company like Under Armour, who makes billions of dollars, then puts out a shoe that looks pretty much exactly like these relatively low rent looking shoes that were made sort of one-offs by a random guy whose son plays in the NBA. So that's not good for Under Armour, but I don't want to get too much on that. But also you had right before the NCAA tournament, which Nike's probably not super happy about, but luckily the NCAA tournament has been so strong and fun to watch, is that I think it was Thursday or Friday morning, Nike came out and said their president, Trevor Edwards, who's been with the company since 1992, basically the right-hand man to CEO Mark Parker, is stepping down. So he resigned, set to retire in August. It was pretty out of the blue. There was no sign that he was going to retire. There was no winding down period, and it's all basically coming down to that same day that they announced Trevor Edwards is resigning. Nike put out a statement saying we're looking into stuff that's going on in-house that's not living up to our standards. And I don't want to speculate too much, but in this climate, it seems like there must be some type of sexual harassment going on. That's all I've been reading, is that's the thought. And then the next day, another Nike executive, Jamie Martin, the general manager of Nike's global categories, he resigned. So some not great news coming out of Nike, but we'll see what happens with that. And then what's also interesting in terms of scandal that sort of involves Nike is that a big Nike-sponsored school, Arizona, they had their scandal before the tournament where ESPN said Coach Miller was approving the payment of DeAndre Ayton, $100,000 to come to Arizona. The stud freshman dominated college basketball this year, but funny enough, they lost on opening night, and he didn't play very well. So that was kind of got downplayed because he's been denying it, but that's still in the news. And then it basically just comes down to all these people are upset about the NCAA, and it gets brought up right around the NCAA tournament, and then people kind of forget about it because the tournament's so fun. And then next year, or the start of college football season, there'll be more talk of why don't these players get paid when you have, say, the coaches at some of these big programs. And I think it's in 48 or something, a huge percentage of states that either the football or basketball coach is the highest paid state employee, which might seem crazy to some people, but then might seem all too obvious to most. So Duke, Mike Krzyzewski, Coach K, he makes $8.9 million to coach at Duke. Almost $9 million to coach Duke basketball, yet they say none of the kids can get paid. So that is when it's hard to argue that there's no money to go around when Mike Krzyzewski makes $9 million to coach college hoops. And then you have Coach John Calipari at Kentucky, Coach Cal. He made this past season $7.5 million. Ohio State's coach, who replaced a living legend in Thad Matta. I don't want to butcher his name. I'm pretty sure it's Chris Holtmann. So I watch a lot of college basketball. I didn't know who Chris Holtmann was before he took the Ohio State job. He made $7.1 million in his first year coaching at Ohio State. So that's crazy. And then you have 12 more Division I men's head coaches that make at least $2.7 million or more. And then this is where people get mad because you have just kids who are the only reason people aren't watching because of the coaches, but they can't get any money besides their scholarship and a little bit of this extra sort of stipends. And that really comes down to, and I'm going to close on a little bit of my own just opinion on what's happening. It's not the NCAA's fault because when they started in the early 1900s, no one watched college basketball or college football because they weren't even really a thing. I mean, horse racing and boxing were the biggest sports. So no one could have ever imagined that you would have CBS and Turner spending $1 billion a year to broadcast 3 weeks of college hoops. And it's not going to be an easy fix. And it just kind of seems like in America, it just happened to us where you tied two big college sports that no one could have seen becoming so popular to higher education, where it doesn't really happen like that anywhere else in the world. You have professional players at just a lower level than the highest levels. And here lower level professional sports have just become college sports, and it's a big problem, and it's going to be a sticky situation for as long as it's going on. I mean, as long as the NCAA tournament's going on and they're making billions of dollars and players don't get paid, people are going to be talking about it. So it's an interesting topic to talk about, and it's fun to read about. So that's going to do it for us. College basketball openings weekend was great for CBS, great for Turner because the games were crazy. It's great for everyone involved, all the advertising partners. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching. I hope you enjoyed listening, and that does it for another episode of Full Court Finance. Until next time, I'm your host, Ben Rains. And remember, if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot us an email over at podcast@zax.com.